Okay, I think we're ready. Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from the Corning Museum of Glass. Wherever you are in the world, we're really thrilled that you have joined us. I'm Kit Maxwell, and I am curator of early modern glass here at the museum, and today I'm joined by Cheyney McKnight. Cheyney is a living historian and an educator and director and founder of the extraordinary Not Your Mama's History. And today she is going to be speaking to us about the experiences of an enslaved lady's maid in the 18th century. But this event is being held in conjunction with the opening of our special exhibition in Sparkling Company, Glass and the Costs of Social Life in Britain during the 1700s, which opens here at the museum tomorrow and will run right the way through to January 2nd. And details about this can be found on our website, and we'll be sharing links to that through the chat throughout the course of this talk. And you'll also find on our website details of our forthcoming 59th annual seminar on glass, which is free online and will relate to many of the themes of the exhibition. But so in terms of the schedule, we're going to be together for about an hour and a half. I'm going to kick off with a short introduction to the exhibition and then hand over to Cheyney, who'll be presenting this new work to us. So we're really thrilled that this is the forum that she has chosen to share. Now, I'm aware that there will be different audiences here. Some are CMOG friends, some I'm sure are Cheyney's followers, and many may be new to us both. So I thought I might kick off with just giving you a little bit of an introduction to the Corning Museum of Glass, to the exhibition, and why this presentation is relevant and how Cheyney and I have come to work together over the course of the last year or so. So may I go on to the first slide, please? Wonderful. So the Corning Museum of Glass is located in Western New York on the historic and present-day territories of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It is not just a museum, it is a campus. It contains the largest and most comprehensive collection of glass in the world, spanning antiquity to contemporary art and design. Next slide, please. And in addition to its incredible collections, it is also home to a world-class, a world-famous glassmaking school known as the Studio, where artists come from all over the world to practice and also to teach. We have a regular program of public glassmaking demonstrations. This photograph obviously taken before the social distancing restrictions currently in place. And we have opportunities for the public still, even in the current circumstances, to make their own glass. We also are home to the Rakow Research Library, which contains collections and archives, manuscripts relating to glass throughout history. It's a really wonderful resource, and on our website you can find out more. And if you're a student or a museum professional, details of the grants that we offer to study here or to research glass more broadly. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, in Sparkling Company, Glass and the Costs of Social Life in Britain during the 1700s is our new exhibition opening tomorrow. And it is a survey of the many innovations, functions, and meanings of glass during the 18th century, ranging from the development of lead crystal, the transformative effects of plate glass, to glass and costume, jewelry, science, and of course the global trade that transformed Britain's economy during this period. Next slide, please. We're also really excited to present a groundbreaking virtual reality reconstruction of a glass paneled room that was last seen over 150 years ago, but originally designed by Robert Adam in the 1770s for the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, two of London's most glamorous aristocrats. We have reunited the surviving panels of this room, which are in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, with the architect's original design drawings, which have come from the Sir John Soanes Museum in London, and combined them with a virtual reality reconstruction that has been several years in the making, but truly worth the wait. If you can't make it to Corning to see it, we will be releasing it on our YouTube channel, a video version of it, so do keep your eyes peeled to our social media. Next slide, please. Last night, we considered with our members Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in London, one of Europe's hottest night spots and trendiest gathering places. and how glass and modern sociability were really closely intertwined. In the 18th century, Britain was something of an anomaly in Europe. Following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the Hanoverian succession of 1714, the power of the throne had been somewhat depleted and divested political authority through parliamentary representation. Royal patronage had been replaced by private entrepreneurship, and court life was replaced by urban sociability. And Britain's urban centres became thronging resorts of finance, of commerce, of science, and sociability, all of which were regulated by ideals of politeness, which enabled the participants to present themselves as members of the polished modern world through a dazzling array of new objects and consumer goods. More types of consumer goods were available to more people than ever before. It was really a transformative moment in the consumption of material culture. Next slide, please. So in surveying the collection here at Corning, selecting objects for the exhibition, there was one theme that presented itself very, very clearly, and that was the role of slavery, of sugar, and the plantation economies of the British colonies in North America and the Caribbean in supporting Britain's economic diversification and its development into a prosperous mercantile nation and a leading global power. And really, it was impossible to talk about Britain in the 1700s with these objects without acknowledging the dependence of Britain on its colonies and empire at this time. Slavery has, of course, existed in societies around the world since ancient times, and we must recognize that it continues to the present day. The history, the impact, the organization, and the scale of European and particularly British Atlantic slavery was never part of my formal education. And this has been an incredibly steep learning curve, and one that it's a journey that I'm continuing on as we speak. I am particularly indebted to Professor Kerry Sinanan at the University of Texas, San Antonio, most especially for the chapter she contributed to the exhibition publication, details of which we'll be sharing. Also to Professor David Lambert of the University of Warwick in the UK, who is currently my supervisor as I embark on a new research degree in Caribbean studies, and to Cheyney, who really helped us expand, develop, and refine the interpretation around these themes in the exhibition. And we'll be sharing a reading list as well if you'd like any more information on these subjects. Next slide, please. So what has all this got to do with ladies' maids? Well, another of the themes we consider in the exhibition is the way in which glass was seen as a metaphor for the ideals of polished or polite behavior that prevailed in the 18th century. The terms polished and polite were often used interchangeably in the language of civility at the time, and glass or glassy qualities were often deployed sort of metaphorically to describe ideal behavior. And key to this were new ideas about the physical presentation of the elite body. That's both in deportment, as indicated in these diagrams, but also in dress and makeup for both men and women. Next slide, please. And thanks to developments in mirror making technology and the establishment of several successful factories in England, I would argue that one of the most iconic forms of glass in the 1700s was the dressing table mirror. And this dressing table set was made for the Earl and Countess of Portland in around 1700, and you can actually just glimpse it over my shoulder. I'm sitting right in front of it now in the galleries. But formal dressing table sets like this were associated with the ritual of the toilette, which was a formal and social ritual in which a person was prepared for the day by their attendants in the presence of a small select gathering. And it could be a lengthy affair, several hours in fact, and it was often accompanied by refreshments and also occasionally by music. Next slide, please. So to illustrate the toilette in progress, we have borrowed several prints in the exhibition, including this one, which is on loan to us from the Metropolitan Museum. and is based on one of a series of 6 paintings by the English artist William Hogarth, which were finished between 1743 and 1745. And they present a satire on the disastrous results of an ill-considered marriage for money and social status. And they're really ridiculing the shallowness and stupidity of people with more money than sense in British society at that time, and people who have more money certainly than taste and are unable to distinguish between good taste and poor taste. And the basic story is of a marriage arranged by 2 self-serving fathers. One is an impoverished nobleman who needs cash, and the other is a city merchant who wants to buy his daughter a place in the aristocracy. Next slide, please. The scene that we have in the exhibition, the scene you see on the screen, is actually number 4 of the series and entitled The Toilette, and it shows the city merchant's daughter, now a countess. And like many in the fashionable world, she's adopted the dubious French custom of an elaborate toilette ceremony, surrounded by luxury and effete attendants and sycophants indulging themselves in sweetened hot chocolate. And among the indicators of this luxury is a young black boy dressed in fanciful oriental costume, unpacking a basket of newly delivered knickknacks bought by the Countess at auction. And it's not an accident that he is presented in a way that suggests that he too is one of these fashionable accessories purchased by his enslaver. There is another black servant in the scene, and somewhat unusually, he's not depicted on the edge of the picture as a peripheral attendant, but right in the center. And while everyone appears to be somewhat oblivious to his presence and totally absorbed by their own folly, he is dexterously navigating the furniture in the crowded room to offer a cup of chocolate on a salver to the Countess's friend. And comparing him to the other figures in the scene, there are several interesting observations. But most relevant, I think, is that he is the only man whose dress or deportment is not made ridiculous by the influence of luxurious French taste. And although, like many of the others, his features are grotesquely caricatured, it seems that he moves through the scene with far more ease, self-awareness, and competence, I suppose, than any other character. He hasn't become effete, stupid, or lazy as a result of exposure to luxury. And he's also one of the most elevated figures in the composition. He's not deferential or subservient, as is often seen in more conventional attendant portraits. Next slide, please. But this, of course, is all a satire, and Hogarth is presenting this entire scene as ridiculous. But the depiction of the competent black servant is an interesting one to reflect upon, because just 2 years earlier in England, one of the leading Enlightenment thinkers of the time, David Hume, published an essay called On National Characteristics, in which he barred Africans from the realms of reason, aesthetic judgment, and taste. And these same views were enforced throughout the century by others, including Immanuel Kant in Germany and Thomas Jefferson in the United States. And these arguments, of course, were central to the justification of slavery, because to acknowledge that Africans or enslaved people of color were capable of aesthetic judgment, and any refined sensibility would, of course, be to recognize equality, which would have undermined entirely the economic justification of slavery. Next slide, please. In Britain, exotically dressed black servants, often young children, were considered prestigious accessories and often prominently displayed by their enslavers in prominent positions in the household. In Britain itself, slavery had a rather ambiguous legal status, which we won't go into here, but the largest black population was to be found in London, and of a total population of about 1 million, let's say, in the 18th century, between 10 and 20,000, I think, were estimated to have been black, and that's about 1 or 2%. However, in Britain's North American and Caribbean colonies, especially the economic powerhouse of the Caribbean, the status of slavery was far less ambiguous. And on Jamaica, for example, the enslaved Black population made up around 90% of the total. And furthermore, white West Indian enslavers were among the wealthiest people in the British Empire, with huge social and political influence back in Britain. In certain parts of the British Empire, in North America and the Caribbean, therefore, during the 1700s, the majority of ladies' maids would have been enslaved Black or Indigenous women. And while the enslaved personal servant was denied any capacity for taste or aesthetic judgment by Enlightenment thinkers, their familiarity and interaction with the objects and the expectations and tastes of the white world they were enslaved to serve were essential in crafting their enslavers' appearance and supporting their status in the polite world. And this paradox, for want of a better word, of being both excluded and essential, not to mention the brutal realities of enslavement, make the experiences of enslaved ladies' maids very different to the daily routines of their hired counterparts, as I think we're going to be discovering. But as a museum curator in the 21st century, recovering the different ways in which different people have interacted with the same objects is an essential component, not only to better understanding the world these objects represent, in which they were made, but also to educating, engaging, and expanding our audiences. Connecting people with objects is really the mission of a curator, and anyone who's listening who is an art historian or a museum curator will attest that once you find a connection with objects, then your mind fires and really anything is possible. So this connection is really, I think, vital to museum practice. So I hope this has served as a sweeping overview to explain the premise of this event and to show how glass, the dressing table, empire, and enslavement can all fit together. And now it is my great privilege to hand over to Cheyney McKnight, who will debut her new presentation, A Day in the Life of an Enslaved Lady's Maid. Take it away, Cheyney.
Thank you very much, Kit. Well done. I guess welcome to A Day in the Life of an Enslaved Lady's Maid. And today I'm going to talk about a few things. First, I'm going to talk about what an enslaved lady's maid is, what are their jobs, what skills should they have possessed, and what was the impact on their lives, the jobs that they did. To start with, I think we just need to come up with a definition for a lady's maid. So it is the maid who attended to the personal needs of her mistress. So ladies' maids, you can find them, references to them all over the world in most cultures around the world, which we will see. And there's just a lot of diversity in where you can find them in society, not just the wealthiest of people, but as we get into the late 18th century, 19th century, you do see middle-class people even having ladies' maids as well, hired ladies' maids. So in the world that we're talking about, 18th century North America, some are hired, some are enslaved, and then there are even a few indentured waiting maids as well. So when we think about the 17th century. Next slide. Just a little bit about my methods. Where am I collecting all my information from? I have to say it's been quite difficult to find information specifically on ladies' maids, and there's a few reasons for that. They have a multitude of jobs and duties, so usually enslaved persons don't just have one job. They may have many, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And I think it was just something that people didn't put in explicit language within journals and narratives. But if we really dig a little bit, sometimes reading between the lines, you start finding a wealth of information about these women. So journals, I really like looking at journals of enslavers, their family members, and of course, travel journals. Most people who follow me know I love travel journals. It's like people who come, especially Europeans who come to America, they really love to pick apart American society, and they comment on everything in great detail. So information about things that everyday Americans wouldn't have written about, people who are traveling to America and observing the experiment that was America would have talked about. Correspondence between enslavers. We have some correspondence that we're going to look at between an enslaver and his colleague who was trying to get back a lady's maid who liberated herself. Slave narratives, there is references to these ladies' maids there, period newspapers. Of course, you'll find runaway ads and even advertisements for sales of ladies' maids. Bill of sales, inventories, wills, broadsides, paintings, drawings, sketches. I prefer sketches because, of course, once you get to the more polished form of a painting or a drawing, it starts to take on a stylized. But if you look at an artist's notes when they're sketching someone, a lot of times you'll get a truer representation of what they're seeing. Next slide. So the $1 million question, why did I jump into researching enslaved ladies' maids? For many of you all, you know that I spend a lot of time researching the average enslaved person. So people who are working in fields and factories in many different conditions, but usually I don't spend a lot of time on talking about people who are enslaved in households. And I decided to remedy that and focus a little bit more on enslaved persons in households. I think I underestimated the impact that these skilled enslaved workers had on the entire enslaved community, on any one farm, plantation, household, or business. They were the eyes and ears of great houses throughout the South and homes in the North as well. I think that when you think of household servants, many of us think of shows like Downton Abbey. Even though Downton Abbey is much later on the timeline, there are some similarities between the work of these enslaved African servants and hired British servants. American households did rely on the many manuals and books that were printed in England on how to run a household, the duties of servants. So you will see a lot of crossover in that because these women are reading from some of the same books that people in England were writing. But the reality of slavery is that the labor is forced. And in this case, it is these people are legal property. They are not hired help. They are legal property of their enslaver. And this changes everything. So hired servants, in many cases, are not allowed to get married and not allowed to be pregnant. On the other hand, enslaved servants in the household, that is not the case. If they get married, if they are pregnant, that is seen as a benefit to their enslaver because they are increasing their holdings. Hired servants can quit or be fired. An enslaved servant cannot quit. They cannot be fired. Being fired means that they are being sold, and that I don't have to explain how different that is from quitting a job. Hired servants have some protections under the law. I'm not going to lie, in the 18th century, there isn't a lot of protection or labor laws enforced. But there is protection. For example, you cannot murder a free person. In many cases, it was illegal to beat a hired servant, whereas obviously it is not illegal. It was not illegal to beat an enslaved servant. So also, I really wanted to overall break down some misconceptions that people have about enslaved house servants. So this idea that there's this huge divide between the house and the fields, and that's just not something that I really saw. I believe you see it more so in ridiculously wealthy households, but in average enslaved households, there is not this huge divide, and that's because people do many different jobs. So only in really wealthy households can an enslaved person have one job, and that's their only job year round. So if you look down on field work, you may be in the field next week. So there isn't that divide in average situations. And I really wanted the challenge of stepping outside of my comfort zone in my research. Next slide. So I thought that we start at the very beginning and realizing that these people, Africans, were not just taken because they were there. They were kidnapped and used as labor because they had skills that Europeans wanted and needed. So next. Africa is the most diverse continent on Earth. There are thousands of ethnic groups. Each ethnic group has very special traditions, languages, governing. They have specific traditions on grooming and styling oneself and each other. Usually, hairstyling is a communal affair because of the nature of many of the hairstyles, braiding, twisting, cutting, different cuts into the hair, different combing methods. And the nature is that you probably need someone else. Next. Perfect. Next one. So you'll see different dressing and scarification. There's different ways in which people adorn themselves and even dress themselves. Sometimes it's dressed communally. Next. I think this is one of my favorite images. This is of the fawn, and they are blacksmiths. This is one reason specifically why West Africans were sought after, because they had a long tradition of ironworking. Next slide. I think we have another picture. Perfect. Another Bantu knots there. Different hairstyle, which would have most likely someone would have done this hairstyle to one another. Next slide. So there is a long West African tradition of maid servants. This is Queen Nzinga with her maid servants there to the right of her. So she's sitting down. She has a long pipe, and you'll notice that her hair is twisted I believe it is twisted. And so her maidservants almost certainly would have done her hair, would have dressed her, would have even put her necklaces on, her bracelets on, packed her pipe. So this is a tradition that was prevalent within West Africa. Wealthy women also would have had maid servants or waiting maids as well. Next. So this is a drawing by William Allen. He was an English naval officer, and he is among the Benin, and he writes in his journal, "The king's wife did the very polite thing by calling on us, attended by her handmaidens. Her hands and feet were deeply tinged with henna, and her lovely eyes were antimony. Her hair, thickly plastered with indigo, was enveloped in a sort of turban, and a country cloth circled her waist with many graceful folds." This was a very unique description to me because it appeared that he was speaking about someone, an equal, whereas I find when Europeans describe Africans during this period, it's a bit degrading. So that's why I chose this description here. And you'll see she is with her maidservants here. Next slide. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the video.
My name is Cheyney McKnight. I'm a living historian, and I live and work in the spaces of Black folks throughout society in order to better understand their lives. From the north to the south, east to west, join us in learning about the day-to-day lives of Black folks throughout North American society. This is Not Your Mama's History presents These Roots. This month, we're at Stratford Plantation, exploring what the day-to-day life was like for enslaved persons who worked in the great houses of plantations in colonial Virginia. Stratford Hall was home to 4 generations of the Lee family. Like the Washingtons, the Randolphs, and the Carters, they had land, money, and lots of enslaved persons that made their lavish lifestyle possible. And today, I'll show you what it was like for enslaved ladies' maids. We don't know specifically which of the enslaved women would have attended to the lady of the great house at Stratford Hall Plantation. But Fick, who is listed in Philip Ludwell Lee's 1776 probate, could have possibly been Elizabeth Steptoe Lee's enslaved lady's maid. A lady's maid's job was not as laborious as other enslaved persons, but it was just as exhausting physically and mentally. Her skills were many. She was in charge of dressing her mistress, changing her mistress' clothes throughout the day. She trained in the care of clothing, hairdressing, makeup creation, and application. She was her mistress' stylist and was expected to keep up with latest fashions, and even sometimes acted as a dressmaker and milliner. And while literacy was not required, it was desirable in order to keep up with the latest fashion trends. A well-known ladies' maid was Ona Judge, who was ladies' maid to Martha Washington. Ona would later escape, citing a desire to simply be a free person. According to enslavers, skilled ladies' maids were hard to come by, so their financial value was high. Her day started around 7:30 a.m., a bit later than other enslaved servants. Her schedule was not set and dictated by the schedule of her enslavers. Simply put, she rose when her enslavers did. The dress and hygiene of enslaved servants in the house were strictly regulated by the enslavers. Unlike their brethren in the fields who tended to have more control over dress and hairdressing, enslaved servants' hair, clothing, and deportment were closely monitored. Hair, skin, and nails were expected to be visibly free of dirt even though soap was not always allotted to enslaved servants. They were expected to independently find ways of keeping themselves clean to the eyes and pleasing to the nose. The clothing of the enslaved was different on every plantation. What an enslaved servant in the household wore was dependent on the enslaver's wealth, station, and style. A lady's maid could be given hand-me-downs from her enslaver, sent to a dressmaker to have clothes made for her, or be ordered to make them herself. We do not know what an enslaved servant at Stratford Hall Plantation would have worn, but looking at images of European ladies' maids and runaway ads, we have an idea. Sarah, described as a Negro woman enslaved as a house servant and seamstress in Prince George County. She carried with her several changes of apparel, among which are remembered a red and white calico jacket and petticoat, a white holland and blue plains ditto, a red flannel petticoat, a purple cloth cloak, a black furred hat with a gold band, button, and loop, a black silk hat, several white linen shifts and aprons, a spotted yarn rug, and Dutch blanket, a pair of English-made leather shoes, and several pairs of thread, cotton, and worsted stockings with a small red leather trunk. At Stratford Hall, enslaved servants lived either in the quarters, in the Great House, or in slave quarters a ways away from the Great House.
So I'm sorry I didn't set that up pretty well, but the video you just saw was the first part of a web series that Not Your Mama's History has started called These Roots. And it explores the day-to-day lives of Black people across America in the 18th and 19th century. And the first episode follows Vic, and she was an enslaved lady's maid at Stratford Hall Plantation in Virginia. And so I wanted to kind of show you in real time a reenactment of what that day looked like. What was she interacting with? How did her morning begin? And I think really jumping into the world of the lady's maid. In the video, I say a lady's maid job was not as laborious as other enslaved persons, but it was just as exhausting physically and mentally. So even though she may not be working out in the hot sun from sunup to sundown, she is doing a lot of labor, both mentally and physically. Her skills would have been very, very diverse. We believe that her training probably would have started around anywhere from age 8 to 11. She would have been trained in the care of clothing, such as needlework, cleaning silk, lace, and linens. She could also be expected to participate in the laundry, but most of the time, she would just be in charge of cleaning small things like lace and silk. She would have been skilled in hairdressing and creating cosmetics. So it's not like today where you can just run to the CVS and pick up some lipstick or some foundation. All of these things had to be mixed so the ingredients could be purchased, brought to the site, or she would have to go purchase them herself, or even go out into the woods and collect them herself. It really depends on what was the trend during the time. She had to, of course, have a sense of style, because she is the person that is really, her enslaver may say, I want my writing habit. What if there are two? What does the day call for? That is something that would be expected of her. Literacy wasn't really required, but we do see ladies' maids who are literate. So when we're looking at runaway ads, sometimes we do come across references to being literate, and that would have been a benefit for their enslaver, because that means that they can read treatise and manuals on creating the latest hairstyles or sewing techniques. It really depends. And of course, dressmaking and millinery. That's something I find goes hand in hand with ladies' maids. Not all ladies' maids are dressmakers, but a lot of them are. So you may see they're skilled in spinning, or they may be skilled in millinery or dressmaking. But usually they have a diversity of skills to offer. Next slide. One of the most famous ladies' maids, enslaved ladies' maids, was Ona or Oni Judge. And this is ladies' maid to Martha Washington. We have here her runaway ad, well, one of them. And I'm not going to go all the way through it, but it was taken out in Philadelphia. And it specifically, it doesn't specifically say who's enslaving her. It depends on which ad you're looking at. One of them does say, and the other one doesn't. So this one says, absconded from the household of the President of the United States, Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled, with very black eyes, bushy black hair. She is of middle stature, slender, and delicately formed, about 20 years of age. She has many changes of good clothes of all sort, but they are not sufficiently recollected to be described, as there was no suspicion of her going off, nor no provocation to do so. It's a little bit shady there. It is not easy to conjecture whether she has gone or fully what her design is, but as she may attempt to escape by water, all matters of vessels are cautioned against admitting her into them. So it goes on, basically saying, be careful, don't let her board a ship, or she may be trying to get into this situation. This is usually how most of her, the runaway ads look. And we have another document from President George Washington to his Secretary of Treasury, Oliver Wolcott. And this is dated September 1st, 1796. I unfortunately could not get permissions to use the original letter, so I will just read it for you. I'll read just two parts of it. The first part. Dear sir, enclosed is the name and description of the girl I mentioned to you last night. She has been the particular attendant on Mrs. Washington since she was 10 years old, and was handy and useful for her, being perfect a mistress of her needle. And then it goes on where he speculates she may be. And then toward the end, he says, I am sorry to give you or anyone else trouble on such trifling occasion, but the ingratitude of the girl, who was brought up and treated more like a child than a servant, and in parentheses, and Miss Washington's desire to recover her, ought not to escape with impunity if it can be avoided. With great esteem and regard, I am always yours, George Washington. So we see, you see this a lot in the correspondence. Both he and Mrs. Washington are just so confounded why she would ever want to run away. They keep saying she had the perfect life there. She was treated like a beloved child and not a servant. And they're just hurt and distraught that she would just run away like this. But we have something very unique that we usually don't have from enslaved persons who liberate themselves. Usually we just have the runaway ad, but in the 1840s, Ona gives a few interviews, and there's one here in the Granite Freeman that's in Concord, New Hampshire. And this is May 22nd, 1845, and it's recorded by Reverend Adams. He says, being a waiting maid of Mrs. Washington, she was not exposed to any particular hardships. If asked why she did not remain in his service, she gives two reasons. The first, that she wanted to be free. And secondly, that she understood that after the decease of her master and mistress, she was to become the property of a granddaughter of theirs by the name of Custis, and that she was determined never to be her slave. So that she provides two reasons. The first being she just simply wanted to be free. She did not want to be enslaved. And the other, she, like most enslaved persons, when they know that they're going to a certain family member or being sold to someone after the death of their enslaver, imagine if they just right off the bat are like, ooh, I do not want to be enslaved by this person. And you do see that a lot. Next slide. Now, one thing we do have some idea of is where enslaved persons were living. We don't have, in every situation, we don't have great detail of every single situation, but this is unique that we have standing quarters all over America. The one on the left is in New York City in the Bronx. This is the slave quarters at the Van Cortlandt House. In the center, that is at Stratford Hall Plantation in Virginia. And the one on the right is on Magnolia Plantation in South Carolina. So we have three very different areas and where enslaved persons were living. And they lived in various situations. We just don't have a lot of information about specifically who was living where. Some enslaved persons lived in, like on the left side, in the attic of some homes. Sometimes they slept at the foot of their enslaver's bed. Sometimes they slept on ticking in the hallway. It really depends. So I can't say for sure where an enslaved lady's maid would have lived. Usually, if they are married, they are living probably in a cabin off-site or up in the quarters in the attic. Next slide. I find that the biggest difference between enslaved house servants and enslaved field hands is that they have less control over their clothing. So the enslavers have a lot of control over the clothing of the enslaved house servants, whereas enslaved field hands tend to have a lot more freedom to wear what they like if they were able to get their hands on it, whether purchased or traded for, or even allotted to them. So in the video, you see hair, skin, nails were expected to be visibly free from dirt. Cleanliness was just, in all of the servants' manuals, you just see cleanliness usually takes up the first half of the book. About how to clean yourself, keep your clothes in order, and brush clean, shoes polished, everything must be impeccable. You shouldn't smell any type of way, no strong smells, no strong scents, and definitely smelling clean. Again, I don't really have information about specifically the clothes, but we do have on the left This is a maidservant in a painting from Scotland, and this is in Brodie Castle in Scotland. The National Trust for Scotland owns this painting on the left here. And on the right, this is Miss Bream Jones. This is from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. She was an enslaved house servant there on the right. So we have two representations of maid servants here. Next slide. We're going to now take a go into the next part of the video, and we're going to look at the actual routine and her interactions with her enslaver here. You can go ahead and start it.
At about the age of 16, Elizabeth Steptoe married 32-year-old Philip Ludwell Lee, becoming the mistress of Stratford Hall. This would have been an advantageous match for her family, as Philip Ludwell Lee was a well-connected member of the Virginia gentry, elected to many governmental positions over his life. Elizabeth, most likely, would have been trained all her life to take on this position. The operation of a manor home fell to the mistress. Her main job was as overseer of the house, in charge of directing, supervising, and disciplining all enslaved workers within the domestic sphere. She was also in charge of deciding what meals were served every day.
Oh, what do we do about eggs today, though?
If you don't mind, may I suggest that we go down to see Benjamin and his wife down in Chantilly. They raise and sell chicken eggs themselves.
Well, that's a fine plan. You may do that. Oh, and while I'm thinking about it, the Randolphs are coming to the midday meal.
She was also organizing social gatherings, entertaining guests, keeping up with household expenses, and when her husband was away, a business partner. Though her job was challenging, she most likely, rarely, or if ever, got her hands physically dirty doing domestic chores. All that fell to an army of enslaved workers. She most likely didn't even put on her own clothes, as that job usually fell to enslaved ladies' maid in wealthy households such as this.
Maybe Mr. Carter, if he's home and not in his townhouse. And whatever children he might have around.
Keeping up with the latest hairstyling and fashion was imperative to pleasing a young mistress.
Last summer, it was the summer before, his daughter came down to the table and she put her hand in front of her face. And when her father inquired what had happened, and of course made her remove the hand, he discovered that she'd shaved off her eyebrows. Can you believe it? She tried to blame it on her brother, but he's quite the troublemaker. But he clearly did not do this. It turns out
An enslaved lady's maid had to walk a tightrope. She had to always be aware that the familiarity she enjoyed with her mistress was a one-sided friendship. Her mistress could share all her worries with her, but she could not share all her worries with her enslaver. A form of code switching was employed. An enslaved lady's maid had to be intelligent and creative enough to be useful, yet docile and meek as not to intimidate and offend. A people person that can read moods in order to anticipate her mistress' needs. She was also a pipeline of information from the enslaver's home to the enslaved community. It was important for her to understand that the flow of information could go both ways if she was careless. A member of the enslaved community, she knew many of its secrets. At times, members of the enslaved community may implore her to speak with their enslaver about things that concern them, such as clothing allotments, travel passes, medical care, and family member whereabouts, as well as slave sales. It was usually those that interacted with the enslavers the most that heard about upcoming slave sales first and could, if they chose, provide an early warning system to the enslaved community. An enslaved lady's maid usually traveled with her enslaver. Vic could be summoned again for wardrobe changes and touch-ups throughout the day. It was Vic's job to be a confidant, a caregiver, and anything else Elizabeth wanted her to be. She was the first face she saw in the morning and the last before her head hit the pillow. She was always ready to be called on throughout the day or night.
So, as you can see, an enslaved lady's maid would have probably been glued to her enslaver's hip through a large portion of the day, especially during the morning. Fick would have been the first face that Elizabeth saw in the morning, and she most likely would have been the last face she saw when her head hit the pillow at night. Her routine would have varied, but generally speaking, what you saw was what you got. Now, when you were looking at a toilette here, this whole gathering of people, as Kit said, this is, of course, satire, but it is like most satire based in some type of truth. So people would have been bringing in tradespersons like shoemakers and wig makers, people bringing millinery and lace into during the morning toilette, also meeting with friends and even family members there. Of course, not just anyone would be invited in, but there was some socialization going on in these spaces. And it became kind of this ritual, especially in France. And as popular trends usually came from France, you also saw that coming into England, and then of course North America as well. So this would have been possibly seen. However, a typical morning, next slide, would have looked something like this, especially for a wealthy woman. She is meeting with a milliner here. This is a image from the National Museum at Stockholm. And so this is 1746. And she's basically here showing off her wares and saying, this is what I have to bring you today. Maybe she made her something, made her a hat, or brought some ribbons. It really depends, to show her mistress. Now so the woman kneeling is the milliner. In the morning, the routine would have looked like she would have usually washed her mistress, usually with a sponge, then dressed her, stockings, garters, shift, stays, under petticoat structure, usually panniers, depending on the time period, over petticoat, second petticoat, and a gown or a jacket of some sort. Then there would have been hair, makeup, again, depending on what is the trend in the during the period. And we talked a little bit about the job of the mistress on a southern plantation, and that is the operation of the home. She's basically overseeing the house and in charge of all the domestic workers, enslaved and hired, within the household. Again, her job probably was very challenging, but it is doubtful that she was actually physically getting her hands dirty unless she wanted to. I highlighted that in Enslaved Lady's Maid, one of her biggest jobs was that she was a confidant for her enslaver. And she really had to walk a very tight rope. She had to always be aware that the familiarity she enjoyed with her enslaver was not something that allowed her to use her enslaver as a confidant. So that's a one-way street. She also had to carry herself and always appear cheerful. I would say a good slave would be someone who was a good actor or actress, who was able to really school their features and not let on when something was bothering them or they weren't particularly fond of their enslaver, or they were angry with them. They were able to keep it in check, but that does not mean that they were pushovers by any means. Next slide. So daily duties that they really had to carry out. I would say right off the bat, emptying the chamber pot, taking out the chamber pot, unless there was a scullery maid in the household, that really probably fell to the lady's maid or even the chambermaid. Opening windows and airing out the room, opening bed curtains, putting away the night's clothes, cleaning the vanity, cleaning the room, clean the pitcher and wash basin, washing vanity tools, sorting garments, removing stains, mending, starching linens and muslin, mending caps and stockings and shirts, whatever needed to be mended. And then also, if something was stolen, she is the one who would get in trouble because it's also her job to prevent theft, which would be difficult because unless she is sitting in the bedroom at all times or in the storage room at all times, it's hard for her to be able to prevent theft. She's also making clothing. As I said before, a lot of ladies' maids, enslaved ladies' maids, were also skilled dressmakers, as seen in runaway ads. She's also preparing the cosmetics. So at this point in the day, probably in the late morning, once her mistress goes to do something else, she's probably mixing some cosmetics for the next day, or replenishing supplies within the tins on the table. Next slide. And what I have mentioned multiple times is that this enslaved ladies' maids are not doing just one job, especially if it's a well-to-do family, but they're not wealthy. So they're rich, but they're not wealthy, meaning that they still have to they still have to budget and balance their household. We find that at some times of the year, enslaved ladies' maids may even be put to work in the fields. They may be put to work in the spinning rooms. Again, it really depends. The kitchen gardens, even in the kitchens. There are also references within runaway ads, the different skills that enslaved ladies' maids possessed. So we have a runaway ad from the Alexandria Advertiser and the Virginia Journal. This is October 21st, 84. Kate, who is described as a mulatto, about 22 years of age, 5 feet high, full face, expressive eyes. Later in the post, it says, she is very handy, spins well, and has been used to both house and plantation work. So says that she is used to it, both of them. So that means that they would have been using her at the same time in both places. And then we have Senna, and she's described as being 20 years of age, darker complexion than Kate. It says she has been brought up in the house and it's a good seamstress and spins well. So we see a little bit more diversity in the skills that they possess. Now, the biggest question I get is, what is the difference between hired white servants and enslaved African servants? We kind of have an idea because here in America, we had them in the same place at the same time. So there were places here where I am in New York, in the Bronx, the Van Bergens, which was a Dutch family in the 18th century, very wealthy. They had holdings, they had investments in the slave trade, wheat, lumber, the transatlantic trade. And they had both African enslaved workers, they had hired white servants, they had enslaved indigenous workers, they also had indentured servants as well. So that must have been a very interesting situations where we had 4 different situations all on one site. So I would think, as I said before, the biggest difference between hired and enslaved is that one is legally property, and the other is considered human under the law, a human being under law. One is property and one is a human being. One can quit, the other cannot. And then, of course, if someone is hired to do a job, you can't just add on 100 other things to that job. Usually hired servants, unless they are a maid of all work, meaning that they are doing a lot of different jobs in the household, they are hired to do one job or a few jobs within the household. Whereas an enslaved lady's maid could be rented out to different households as a lady's maid, or picking wheat in the fields. We don't know. So there's a great diversity of the jobs that enslaved ladies' maids possessed. Next slide. And as I said before, I really want to drive home that these people had agency, and they really fought to hold on to their culture. They would take property and sometimes sell it and use it to even purchase their own freedom. They would slow down work to protect young people and the elderly. And in the case of enslaved ladies' maids, they used their proximity to their enslavers to ensure that they were providing information to their community. And we have a lot of examples. Please, please, please read the WPA narratives. Look through those. They're at the Library of Congress, and they are 100% free. I know it's a later period. It is the 19th century. It talks about slavery in the mid-19th century, but there are some themes that run true throughout the history of enslavement in this country. And so they're also providing information about slave sales and who's about to be punished, so that people have a chance of getting away in time. And lastly, I really wanted to show you the ending of Fick's story. Next slide.
While her mistress is going about her day, a lady's maid has a variety of duties to occupy her day. Everything was expected to be pristine and of the utmost quality. Fick sewed clothes that she could never wear and made makeup that she could never use. In addition to their main duties, ladies' maids also did general housekeeping work. Fick would have been expected to stay awake and close by until her mistress was ready for bed. She could be expected to stay up until the rising sun, depending on which guests are there.
They done up there yet?
Of course not. They're gonna be up there till 2 a.m.
I never know when to cook my own.
Eat you out of house and home.
I tell you, I'm about done with this here. How about going up, see where they are, and come back down and let me know.
All right, will do. We don't know the end of Fick's story, but from records, we know that in 1801, she was taken to the Westmoreland courthouse to be put up as collateral for Henry Lee's non-payment of debts. Apparently, the Lees were able to satisfy the debt or get her back in some other way, because Carter Lee talks about seeing Mammy Fick and other enslaved servants standing in the door as his family sees him off to boarding school in 1807. And that's all we know about her later years.
Thank you all very much for sticking with me through the presentation. I hope that you learned a little bit about the world of enslaved ladies' maids in 18th century America. And I really felt a broader understanding of the enslaved community from really jumping into the world of enslaved servants, because my whole life I was told that there was this animosity between people in the house and people in the fields, but I really came to understand that there was shared kinship. For example, people in the household, most likely their parents, basically their husband or wife or children, were people who worked in the field. So this idea that there's this huge animosity is just something that I didn't really see as prevalent as you would see in movies and TV shows. There was also a shared culture, and people were intermarrying between the house and the field. So if nothing else, please take away that the enslaved community was just that, a community, and it extended into the house. And I have some items that I want to show you, but I don't know, Kit, do we have some time?
I think we have about 15 minutes, and my colleagues are going to be feeding through questions in the chat. But I mean, it would be great to see some of these while the questions come through. I do have plenty of questions myself, but why don't you go ahead and show us some objects, because it's really fascinating to see.
So, of course, I am obsessed with the toilet set. You know this, Kit. When you showed it to me, I was like, oh my goodness, right there. So this is actually something that you probably looks very familiar to you, Kit. And of course, I don't have a full set because I am not a wealthy 18th century landowner. But this is something that possibly you would put cosmetics in, or pins, or hairpins, or straight pins. And they came in many different sizes. These have velvet in them, depending on what goes into them. And then this is a pot that Vic may have used to mix cosmetics. It would go in here. And it has a lip here because you can take hog splatter and tie it off. So it kind of forms, it's very similar to cling wrap once it's dried, and it kind of keeps its form there. Granted, I wouldn't advise anyone to do that now. And this is one of my favorites. It's a tin that I keep calling it a tin. It's not made from tin. It would have been made of silver or and we have the cushion on top. And then lastly, I'm to show you some of my irons, my period irons. We have this one. And do not worry, I do not use this on people's hair. Emily probably would have ended our friendship then and there if I had brought this torture device out. I have modern reproductions of these that are safe. And then we have the paplote iron here, which you use cut paplote papers, which are in triangles. You roll up a piece of hair, fold it into the paper, and then you press it using this piece. Looks like a torture device, doesn't it?
They do, and you can see them in use, in fact, in the print we have in the exhibition, the Hogarth one that you showed as well, the satire.
Yeah. And oh, something from West Africa. We do have a comb here. This is a hair pick. So this is something that waiting maids and maid servants in West Africa would have used on their mistress' hair.
Well, Cheyney, I do have, can I go, if you're ready for a question, if you don't mind talking some more, I'd like to ask you some. And bring it back to sort of museums, because you're a living historian and you embody the narrative really, and the objects support you in sharing that story. In museum, we kind of have the opposite, and people bring their own stories. That's how they make these connections. I don't know if it's the same in US country houses, but so often in the UK, you will go to a museum or a country house, and it will be go into a room and it's filled with the most extraordinary, rare furniture. The labels may be wonderfully written, concisely explaining the Rococo style and the sea scrolls on a chair or something. But inevitably you'll hear someone say, oh, I wouldn't want to clean that. Or I've got one a bit like that at home. And so it's a way that people connect with objects. And it's from that point that you can begin to learn more about them. And I'm just wondering whether, as a descendant, when you visit museum spaces and you look at objects from the 18th century, the 19th century, whether you feel that you have room to bring those connections, whether they're kind of enabled. I mean, no museum label can contain all information about an object's history and the experiences associated with it, but do you feel enabled or empowered to connect to objects in museums? And if not, what do you think museums can do?
Yeah, I think usually when I go to the museums, I think that it's kind of a fine line when you're looking at museum labels, because I mean, there comes a point when you put too much interpretation and spin within the labels, when some people are like, I really want to know, what is this? And why is this important to this site here? Sometimes who was using it and how was it used? So that comes in sometimes when I look at a label and it says that let's use Elizabeth Steptoe Lee. This is a made up label that I'm doing. Stratford Hall does not have a label like this. But if it were to say, Elizabeth used this pot to heat water. Well, did Elizabeth, the mistress, really put this pot over the water, over the fire, and heat it up and carry it upstairs? I think just being very clear and concise, if you're going to say this was used by someone, saying this pot was used by Fick or an enslaved lady's maid to heat up the water, being very specific. I really look to interpreters and docents to kind of really build out the full story of what was happening in that room. And depending on if someone is going at it alone or in a tour or a group. But I think for labels, I really hope that you get more specific. And it doesn't have to be this whole let's whip ourselves and really throw it on, because then it can seem a bit pandering, but really being very concise about what it was used for. As a descendant going to sites when I was younger, it was very frustrating because I would see a lot of labels that were just very insensitive or very ignorant of what something was being used for and by whom. So I think that's all changing. Hopefully.
Yeah, well, yes. I'm curious that you mentioned that it doesn't have to be a sort of a kind of an experience of shame, and that's really interesting because there are so many debates in the museum world. I know in England in particular, where there is a resistance to incorporating stories of colonization and enslavement because it's posited that we are museums would be presenting a national history with shame. But you brought up the subject of resistance, and those are not stories of shame at all. And the notion that the dressing table could be a site of resistance, I think, is a really interesting one. And I was reading an article recently about a forthcoming book, The Secret History, The Warrior Women Who Fought Their Enslavers. And I think the book is written by Rebecca Hall. And the review mentioned that apparently 1 in 10 ships trafficking enslaved Africans experienced some kind of revolt or resistance, mainly because women and children were unchained and then had access to kind of, they could facilitate the resistance. the notion that ladies' maids were involved in that too, in communities, unlike Britain, the island of Britain, but in its colonies in the West Indies and in America, where enslaved women served in the house in much greater proportions than they were in Britain, that they could have been the kind of the instigators of resistance, I think is a really interesting fascinating concept. We do have some questions coming in. We've got about 5 minutes. I could carry on talking for a great deal longer, but let's get some of these. We've had a question about what will some of the next episodes of these routes cover?
I'm so excited. So this is just following Black folks in 18th and 19th century. So the second episode will be an enslaved cook. The third episode, the third and fourth, interchangeably may be either a enslaved servant in a New York house and a free Black hired domestic worker in the 19th century in New York. And then from there, we want to do another free person of color. We're wanting to make sure we get as broad of an experience of Black folks in America during the time. So also, we are always open if there are sites who are willing to welcome our crew.
And where can we see these episodes? Where will they be?
Oh, thanks for asking. Our episodes come out 2 weeks early to our Patreon. So you can join my Patreon, Not Your Mama's History, or you can join our YouTube, Not Your Mama's History YouTube page, because after those 2 weeks, so this Monday, these routes will be released to YouTube. So you'll be able to see it there. So subscribe.
Fantastic. And I think we can look out for some glass objects that were made here at Corning, like yes. Glass urinal, I believe, it's among them.
Yes, actually, we already filmed a view of the wonderful pieces that Corning made me. They're very unique because my followers know I'm a bit of a weirdo, so I asked for some really complicated pieces thinking that Corning would say no, and they were like, we could do that. I was like, what? So tune in for that.
We wouldn't miss it for the world. And there are just a couple of other resources that I thought I would share before we end. The Diaries of Mary Prince are a fascinating account of an enslaved maid from Bermuda who was brought to England and claimed freedom, liberated herself, and then her life story was published, went through numerous editions, and was quite important in the abolitionist movement at the time. And also the novel of The Infamous Rosalie by Eveline Trouillot is an account of enslaved women in the French Caribbean in the 18th century. And it's a really, really powerful story based on fact, but it's a work of fiction, but incredibly well researched. So Cheyney, as we end our discussion, I'll finish with one more question. What would an enslaved lady's maid have done if they had time to themselves? Do we have
That's a great question. I think what many other enslaved persons, or I would say just people in general during the time, possibly spend it with family. If they could, spend it with their children. If they didn't have children, I think that in places like New York, we just finished celebrating Pinkster here in New York. So that is a chunk of time that they may have had off. And they probably would have gone to a Pinkster celebration, which would have been dancing and a huge party for a few days and hanging out with people. So I think spending time with family, possibly going to an event with other enslaved persons, or if ever they had time to sleep in, I think they would have gotten some sleep. At least that's, it may be tinging my my own experiences after spending a few days in fixed shoes. I was exhausted. I was very exhausted. So the first thing that comes to mind is sleep.
Well, Cheyney, thank you very, very much for sharing that with us. I know that it was a preview and we were really lucky to have it. And thank you for all your work with us on this exhibition. It really wouldn't be what it is without you. And we can't wait to have you here in person. And you'll be joining us in October for a seminar to discuss some of the interpretive approaches. So I hope that all your followers will register for that. It's a free event and details are on our website. But thank you again, and look forward to seeing you in person. Thank you everyone for joining us.